announcement. Mr. Goodman has served in many different roles. Right now, he is the William Simon Chair in Political Economy at the very influential and famous Center for Strategic and International Studies. I think many years ago, whenever I read any writings by people at the CSIS, they were mostly on strategic issues and topics. But today, Mr. Goodman will address the other area of research, that is economic policy making and so on. Mr. Goodman previously served in the White House, especially as the Director for International Economics at the National Security Council. So prior to that, he was also Senior Advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs. And prior to that, again, he worked at Goldman Sachs as well as the Treasury Department. So he has a long list of very distinguished, prestigious positions. So let's welcome him to share with us his recent research on the One Belt, One Road, and he will especially look at the One Belt, One Road program, as I would say, from the American perspective. So let's welcome him. Okay.
Thank you. I think I'm wired, so I'm good. Thank you very much, Professor Chen. It's really my honor to be here. I'm delighted to see such a enthusiastic crowd, and it's my first time speaking at Hong Kong University, so I'm really honored to be invited. Actually, you let me start with one of my jokes that I make about my role at a think tank which is focused on national security and defense related issues, but I do economics, so I often joke, and I'm not sure this joke is going to translate into Hong Kongese, but I think you're a smart audience, you'll get it, that my colleagues who work on the traditional CSIS issues work on life and liberty, and I work on the pursuit of happiness. And so we, but this is a strategic story, and so we're very interested in it as a center. We've been actually following this story of infrastructure investment across the Eurasian landmass, the supercontinent of Eurasia, for a couple of years. You know, Belt and Road, or as it was called, One Belt, One Road at the time, certainly, should I move this down a little bit so it doesn't get quite so much feedback? One Belt, One Road certainly sparked our interest, but I think we're interested in the broader story about infrastructure, what I call the Great Game. As you all know, Rudyard Kipling talked about the Great Game between Britain and Russia to control, basically Central Asia and Afghanistan and so forth. And I think of this in some ways as a competition. It's not just about what China's trying to do, but what Japan and India and Turkey and Russia and other countries are trying to do. Competition, in my view, is not a bad thing. I'm an economist, so competition actually can make us all better. But it does introduce a sort of slightly different perspective. So this is about the broader story, but I know that the particular interest here is about Belt and Road, so I'll certainly talk about that. So let me start with one small piece of the story. So this is Khorgos. Khorgos is a point on the border between China and Kazakhstan. It is this picture. That's my best side here. This was May of last year. I went down there from the Kazakh side. This is a point about 3 kilometers inside Kazakhstan, where there is a large facility which is broadly, the central piece of which is a dry port. A dry port, which I didn't know what a dry port was until I went there, is a place where you do port-like activities but on dry land. And the reason for that is that, as I'm sure you all know as students of history, Tsarist Russia was afraid of being invaded by unwashed Europeans, and so they created a rail gauge which was wider than the European gauge. So Kazakhstan, as a former Soviet state, used the wider gauge, which you see here, which goes on into Kazakhstan. This is the Chinese track terminating inside Kazakhstan. And so that creates a bottleneck at both ends of the Soviet Union, as it were. And so the traditional, over the last 100 years, the way to solve that problem was that you had to lift the train, widen the wheel gauge, and put the train back on the wider track. That takes about 3 or 4 hours and is quite inefficient. This model is actually, as you can see, you've got seaport cranes here which lift the containers from the Chinese track to the Kazakh track, and then this can be done in about 45 minutes for a 40-container train, so it's much more efficient. And as you'll see, it's combined with, well, actually, let me just start by saying, this is a satellite image of Khorgos in 2010. The Chinese border is actually just to the right of the screen, but it basically looked like the moon. I was saying earlier that I think literally this is just about the point on the planet Earth which is furthest from any sea water, salt water. If you stand here, you are just about as far from salt water as you can be, so it really is very remote. That was in 2010. This is today. So I was standing here's the train coming in from China, and it terminates right there. I was standing right there. But what you also have in this area is a large logistics center, which has, or will have, a warehousing side and a manufacturing side. So the business model that is being offered to particularly Chinese exporters is that you can bring whole products through and you can quickly get them through this space and into Kazakhstan. Or you can bring parts, store them in the warehouses, manufacture them, assemble them here, get a made in Kazakhstan stamp, and then send it on its way into the Eurasian Economic Union, Russia, Belarus, and a couple of other countries, tariff-free. So this facility is operated by Dubai Ports World, so it's a pretty significant, pretty sophisticated international zone. And the reason I start, by the way, in theory, a dry port like this can lower the cost and time of land-based shipments between Asia and Europe from a couple of weeks to maybe 10 days, and capture some portion of ocean-based trade, which currently accounts, as you know, for more than 90% of global commerce. So I use this as an example and to start the presentation of this project that we're working on because it highlights a bunch of things. It highlights the fact that there is this land-based story which is emerging. There are real things happening here. There are things being built. This is part of the Belt and Road, by the way. China is providing funding for this project. And so things are happening. And there are big questions about what this impact is going to be on commerce and potentially on other things, but at least at its core, what's going to happen to commerce. And yet, when I was there, as you saw, there were no trains. And so the guy told me, the trains will be here this afternoon, and maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But in a way, it's a metaphor for me of whether, and particularly after driving 5 hours down a bumpy road from Almaty to this point, with nothing really along the way, your sort of imagination gets going about how challenging it's going to be to actually make a viable economic proposition out of even this sophisticated space. So in a way, it's a good metaphor for me. And it's why I sort of think of this as part of a new great game across this region, because a lot of this kind of activity is going on, and I think there are big questions about what it'll all amount to. But it may well be something big. Think about the Trans-Siberian Railway. Last year was the 100th anniversary of the Trans-Siberian Railway from Moscow east. And the construction of that line did a lot of things. It helped catalyze the Russo-Japanese War. It helped Russia move its heavy industries away from enemy lines during World War II. It helped, still today, more than half of foreign cargo passes through Russia, goes along the Trans-Siberian Railway. So these things could have very long and significant impacts in economic and other affairs. So I think it's important to sort of think about this in a broader historical and geographical perspective. Okay, so having set the scene, let me sorry, because I do need the written word here for some of the statistics and things that I'm going to use. So apologies while I shuffle this around a little bit. So let me just outline briefly what I'm going to do today. So I'll talk about something that seems obvious, but I think it's important to talk about what is infrastructure and why does it matter. I'll talk about these competing visions, including China's Belt and Road, but some others as well, challenges and risks ahead. Then, since you want to hear a U.S. perspective, I'll give you some thoughts on U.S. interests and how we're responding to it or not. And I'll talk about our project at CSIS. So, what is infrastructure? Well, I mean, obviously, it's all these things. It is, in an Oxford English Dictionary definition, infrastructure is, quote, the basic physical and organizational structures and facilities, e.g. buildings, roads, power supplies, for the operation of a society or enterprise. So that's a very abstract definition. It does highlight a few useful points. It obviously, infrastructure relates to a bunch of physical structures, such as the ones shown here, but also this definition makes clear that what's important about infrastructure is the role it plays in our economies and our societies. The design of this infrastructure or the absence of infrastructure can play a powerful impact on how humans behave. Whether, looking at patterns of trade and economic activity between countries, whether looking at the impact on shaping relations between nations, either potentially preventing war or enabling war. Infrastructure has a powerful impact. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., where I live, and tried to ride on our metro, then you know that infrastructure can have a powerful impact on our daily lives, for good or bad, in our case. So it's important to think of it not just as a four-syllable word that's a little bit uninteresting and a bunch of hard stuff, but actually something that actually affects economies, societies, and international relations. And third, and very importantly, infrastructure is not just about hard things, it's also soft infrastructure. For infrastructure to be useful, it has to address a number of soft infrastructure issues, such as customs forms and border procedures, legal structures, tax systems. All of this has a big impact on how infrastructure is built, how it's used, and how it's maintained. So, for example, it's fine to build a road in the middle of nowhere in Indonesia, but if there's a toll that discourages people from using the road, then it's not much use. So you have to consider that when you're looking at this story, the soft infrastructure dimensions. So let me shift to some of the specifics about the story in Asia. This is a snapshot from our website, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But when I say Eurasia, I mean not just Central Asia, but I mean the whole Eurasian landmass, the supercontinent. That's what we're looking at. So essentially, we're talking about a part of the world that accounts for about 1/3 of the planet's land area, more than half of global GDP, and more than 60% of the global population. It's obviously home to some of the most dynamic economies in the world, but also some of the most difficult and intractable political conflicts, from North Korea to the Fergana Valley. Eurasia enjoys obviously enormous economic potential, but also some very serious challenges, and infrastructure is high on that list of challenges. Despite several decades of impressive economic growth, in Asia alone, 300 million people still do not have access to safe drinking water. 400 million people do not have access to electricity. 1.5 billion people do not have access to basic sanitation. Tens of millions of people are living in high-risk coastal flooding zones, and more are moving to these areas as urbanization rates increase, raising the potential cost of extreme weather events. Infrastructure can help mitigate all of these challenges. It can also help create resilient cities, reduce the risk of waterborne pathogens, strengthen trade integration, and boost growth and job creation, among other positive effects. Unfortunately, the region as a whole faces a severe and worsening infrastructure deficit. Earlier this year, you may know that the Asian Development Bank did an estimate from its member countries, among its member countries, and it found that only half of the $1.7 trillion of annual infrastructure need, that is a need for infrastructure to do at least three things: to sustain the region's growth, to eliminate poverty, and to tackle climate change. To achieve those three things, we would need $1.7 trillion per year of new infrastructure, which is a total of $26 trillion by 2030. You know, a staggering number. And this is the story behind why countries are lining up to fill this gap. And obviously, the Belt and Road Initiative, China's Belt and Road Initiative, is the best known of these, but not the only one. So this map, which is also on our site, it's our own map, but it's based on the one that you're, I'm sure, familiar with, the basic Belt and Road story, shows kind of the broad vision for Belt and Road, or BRI, if I can call it that from now on. The obvious feature of just this map is the scope and ambition of Belt and Road. But the fact is, you know, we know relatively little about Belt and Road in very specific terms. For example, China says that 68 countries are involved in BRI, but many of the memoranda of understanding, the MOUs that have been signed, have not been publicly disclosed, so it's not clear, you know, whether that number is accurate or whether it's comprehensive. Estimates about BRI's dimensions vary, but you know, certainly it's a massive endeavor. It could include numbers as high as $4 trillion of infrastructure. And by the way, the Marshall Plan in today's dollars would have been worth about $130 billion, 130 billion. And so if China is aiming to build $4 trillion, it's a much bigger endeavor than the Marshall Plan. But it isn't just China. And a lot of other countries are putting real money behind these efforts. Japan, for example, has launched a partnership for quality infrastructure with a goal of spending $200 billion on new infrastructure investments. Tokyo's vision prioritizes east-west connections, and especially in Southeast Asia, where it has been investing heavily for many years. But frankly, in response to the challenge from China, Tokyo has stepped up these efforts, both bilaterally and through multilateral institutions like the ADB, which it has a very powerful influence over. By the way, to show that it's a competition, it's no coincidence that when Japan rolled out its partnership for quality infrastructure, first of all, the use of the word quality was deliberately, I think, intended to try to differentiate the Japanese from the Chinese approach. But also, at that point, I think the AIIB had just been, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank had just been launched, and the stated capital of that institution was going to be $100 billion. And so Japan's plan was announced as $110 billion. So clearly there's some competitive dynamic going on here. India's infrastructure plans, meanwhile, focus more on internal connections within India, but these also go across the Indian Ocean, or their vision goes across the Indian Ocean to Southeast Asia. And I put these two countries up in particular because increasingly they are working together. So this week, for example, Prime Minister Abe is traveling to India to lay the cornerstone for a high-speed railway. And together with Prime Minister Modi, they're expected to launch something called the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which is an initiative that some observers see as a counterweight to the Belt and Road. And there are other consequential actors at play. On our site, we have maps like these for Russia, Turkey, Iran, Korea, and Southeast Asia so far. So let's talk about motivations. The motivations on a sort of simplistic spectrum that I've created run the gamut. So think about Belt and Road. Obviously, Belt and Road is the singular foreign policy initiative of Chinese President Xi Jinping. And as you know, this is how he described it in a speech in the United States in 2015. Quote, "Our Belt and Road Initiative, our establishment of the Silk Road Fund, and our proposal to set up the AIIB are all aimed at helping the common development of all countries rather than seeking some kind of spheres of political influence." So by this account, the motivation for BRI is to supply needed public goods to the world. But even if this is true, BRI also has the potential to generate significant commercial, economic, and strategic benefits for China itself. So BRI supports economic growth in China's underdeveloped Western regions and offers an organizing principle through which President Xi can push forward elements of his bureaucratic reform agenda. So it's got uses at home. Beijing is struggling to manage, as you know, enormous industrial overcapacity, particularly in sectors related to construction, such as steel and aluminum. And BRI offers commercial opportunities for Chinese companies that would help unload some of this excess capacity. The new routes envisaged as part of BRI have the potential to generate significant new trade opportunities. This would help to strengthen China's economic integration with countries hosting BRI projects and diversify its access to commodity resources. BRI also has the potential, as you move down the spectrum, to generate important political and diplomatic benefits for China. Beyond entrenching Beijing's economic influence, and China was already the largest trading partner of more than 120 countries as of 2012. BRI is part of a larger public relations campaign to reinforce the message of China as a responsible global power. If BRI succeeds in bringing growth to the countries along China's periphery, in particular, countries like Pakistan, Myanmar, Kazakhstan, that might also improve China's security position. So going all the way to the end of the spectrum here. And of course, many of the infrastructure projects being built, ports, for example, have potential dual uses that could support China's strategic and military objectives. One could apply this spectrum of motivations to really all of the countries participating in the infrastructure push across Eurasia. It's not just China. And any explanation that only looks at either the altruistic end or the very sinister end of the spectrum is probably missing some of the important drivers. I think it's a mix of factors with relative emphasis depending on the country you're talking about. So a big undertaking, lots of motivations. What are some of the challenges? Well, what all of these infrastructure visions have in common is their ambition, right? There's no question they're bold. But the real question is whether they can overcome some serious obstacles. And if they do, how that impacts the strategic and economic landscape of Eurasia. For starters, infrastructure is a difficult business, even in the developed world. Again, as I mentioned, come to Washington and I'll show you how difficult it is. Big infrastructure projects, very costly, technically complex, slow to generate promised returns, if they ever do. You may know that researchers at Oxford University at the Said Business School have shown that mega projects, those costing over $1 billion, almost always end up being completed late and over budget and with less than the promised benefits. Controversially, that group headed by a Dane named Bent Fluvberg, who's done some really interesting but controversial work, looked at 95 internal Chinese infrastructure projects, I think it was 95, and concluded that more than half of them destroyed economic value, did not create economic value. So despite the myth that infrastructure has been always a good thing, even in China, that's not necessarily the case, or according to his research, which is, as I say, is not uncontroversial. But then if you think about Asian countries with the biggest infrastructure needs, such as Tajikistan or Afghanistan or Laos or India, obviously you don't have to stretch your imagination far to imagine all the additional challenges, some of which I've listed up here. These countries have rough geographies, harsh climates. When an area is remote and difficult to access, extremely wet or has large swings in temperature, then all of this wears on infrastructure and makes it more expensive both to build and to maintain. Meanwhile, project selection and procurement require navigating labyrinthine local politics. Moreover, especially in developing countries, unclear land rights can complicate the acquisition process and raise the risk of social conflict. Extensive red tape or lack of bureaucratic capacity can draw out the investment process, increasing costs for countries ill-equipped to afford them. Add in weak rule of law, corruption, environmental challenges, uncertain macroeconomic and political environments in many developing countries, and it's clear why many infrastructure projects fail. Against this backdrop, I just want to pause and emphasize one point about how much infrastructure we, quote unquote, need. The estimates that I cited earlier from the ADB and others looked at how much infrastructure investment is theoretically needed to achieve a certain level of growth or other objectives based on historical experience. There's some problems with this approach, though. One issue is the amount of infrastructure that countries need is not the same as how much they can afford. From a financial perspective, projects actually need to be, so you may have heard the term bankable. Either they generate revenue, such as through tolls, or there's some form of tax revenue used to pay for their costs. That's basically the only way these things are paid for, user fees or tax revenue, general tax revenue. And the reason for this, to emphasize this, is that the size of Asia's estimated need is much greater than the number of bankable projects, or the amount that actually is likely to be built and generate a return. So if a country needs 40 billion in infrastructure, there may only be 20 billion or less of projects actually available. And that's the environment we're in fact dealing with today. So a shortage of bankable projects that offer returns commensurate with their risks is the biggest hurdle in all of this. Bankability will be even more difficult for Asia's overland routes than for their maritime counterparts, as sea freight is slower than railway and air cargo, but considerably cheaper. Even when the roads and railways are built, they may not deliver the promised economic benefits. This would mean the $26 trillion gap identified by the ADB goes unfulfilled, and that infrastructure doesn't contribute what it could to solving problems like poverty, poor health, nutrition, political instability, and climate change. Which leads me to a couple of risks that I think emerge from all of this. And one of them is unmet expectations. So expectations have been set very high that there's going to be a lot of activity, economic activity and development and trade generated from all of this investment. This picture you probably know, or you know this story about the first freight train that completed a journey from China to the United Kingdom in January. This, like Korgos, points out that a lot of things are happening. Infrastructure is changing the landscape of Eurasia. But it's important to note that flashy developments like this new train are not entirely what they seem. There was a 3-month gap between when the train arrived from China and when it returned as it waited to be refilled. The goods that were ultimately shipped, whiskey, baby's milk, pharmaceuticals and so forth, were relatively low value. And the train apparently was only about 1/3 filled. So there are questions about the economic activity that's going to be generated, and that raises questions about whether there are going to be unmet expectations from all of this. The second risk is unintended consequences. And this slide shows a protest from earlier this year at Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, a story that you're probably familiar with. It reminds us that infrastructure investment, especially large-scale projects, have the potential to generate a host of unintended and often undesirable side effects. Without careful attention to the social impact of investments, which can sometimes displace large numbers of local residents, there's the potential to undermine stability in host regimes or produce powerful political blowback, as happened in Sri Lanka or, as you know, in Myanmar a few years earlier with the so-called Mitsune Dam, which China had to withdraw from. Moreover, large sudden inflows of funds can have a severe impact on host country debt burdens. For example, the IMF has estimated that outflows from Chinese investors repatriating profits are a medium-term threat to Pakistan's economic stability. So they've actually identified specifically these issues as a threat to Pakistan. When loans are used to pay for low-quality projects, high maintenance costs can add to the long-term fiscal burden for local governments. Other unintended consequences obviously include environmental damage, as I mentioned. Projects completed without attention to environmental sustainability can cause a range of problems, whether disrupting the migratory patterns of local fish or increasing rates of soil erosion. So as we consider the infrastructure visions of China and others, it's important to understand, both their grand strategic implications, and there are those, and there's a uniting vision that could make all this possible, but also that there are a lot of ground level political, economic, and geographic realities that are likely to challenge the sponsoring country's ambitions along the way. So let's shift to U.S. interests. Why should people in the United States care about these developments? Well, again, as I said at CSIS, we see this as kind of a new, important story, maybe one of the biggest stories of the 21st century, certainly in this part of the world. So we have a sort of intellectual interest in what's happening, why and what the implications might be. But for the U.S. as a whole, the stakes may be quite high. First, we obviously have significant commercial interests in this story. U.S. infrastructure companies, including related service providers, financial, legal, consulting, other service providers, have an important opportunity to tap into this dynamic market and grow with it. Along with U.S. officials, they can bring experience setting standards and safeguards that will help Asia connect in a more sustainable way. Frankly, Belt and Road could mean restricted commercial opportunities as Chinese rules, norms, and standards, such as for high-speed trains or mobile network encryption, tilt the commercial landscape against U.S. companies. This has the potential to harm Hong Kong companies as well. BRI could also mean for the United States reduced political influence in this region. If at some point in the future all roads lead to Beijing, then this will obviously represent a historic restructuring of Eurasia's economic geography that will firmly embed China as the economic and diplomatic center of the region. Certainly something that's possible, but has implications for the United States. As countries seek to orient themselves in response to China's enhanced economic and strategic position, it could be harder for the United States to effectively advocate on issues ranging from maritime disputes to human rights. At the end of the spectrum I showed earlier, the ports being built with Chinese money will strengthen China's military or naval capabilities and could enable Beijing to squeeze the United States out from maritime domains across the Indo-Pacific region. All of this is a worst-case scenario, but I highlight this, and I do this more for American audiences than I do for non-American audiences. But it's clear that we have a huge stake in this, and it's time for us to engage thoughtfully and strategically to seize these opportunities that are presented here and to mitigate any risks. Unfortunately, the U.S. government today is not focusing on this. We're not organized effectively. We're not responding to this epochal development. For one thing, each agency in the U.S. government organizes its work just geographically across Eurasia differently. So the State Department, for example, has separate bureaus on East Asia, South and Central Asia, Europe, Middle East, whereas the Defense Department, for example, bundles all of Asia together. Or at least bundles India with East Asia, Pakistan with Afghanistan. So it's a mess. We don't coordinate even geographically. Moreover, there's no single agency that has primary responsibility for infrastructure issues, and little or no coordination at the White House. Even when I worked at the White House, if you'd asked me who was in charge of infrastructure policy, I would have not known where to send you. And to the extent that the White House is focused on infrastructure, it's almost exclusively focused on domestic infrastructure in the United States, which again, as a citizen and a Washington, D.C. resident, I think is partly appropriate, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time, as we say. We ought to be engaged in this international story as well. We don't need a Marshall Plan. You might ask, and a lot of people do ask, what does the U.S. have to offer? We don't need a Marshall Plan for Europe. In fact, we're not likely to engage in one. We're not going to spend $130 billion today on this story. But we do need a strategy. Rather than throwing money at the issue, we can get ourselves better organized and mobilize the capabilities that we do have. And among those capabilities and strengths are our legal, financial, and technical expertise. And that can help be brought to bear on developing principles for infrastructure investment in the region, covering procurement, natural disaster resilience, environmental, social safeguards, debt sustainability, many issues that we have been involved in and interested in for a long time. I think Washington could help build a consensus around these principles through its work in the multilateral development banks, World Bank, and so forth, with like-minded partners, including Japan and the European Union. We can help reinforce this through the G20 and other multilateral bodies. And at home, rather than perennially threatening to defund the U.S. Export-Import Bank, which is again on the table, the president may be about to appoint a former congressman who once submitted legislation to close the U.S. Export-Import Bank as the president of the U.S. Export-Import Bank, or the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which provides sovereign risk insurance and so forth to investment. Rather than trying to defund these agencies, which actually contribute money back to the U.S. Treasury, they make money. Congress and the White House should instead double down on these cost-effective tools to help support our interests abroad. And then, really importantly, is the ability or what potential for the U.S. to mobilize our private sector to invest in this story. There was a New York Times report yesterday, I guess, or the day before, on the Belt and Road Summit here in Hong Kong on Monday. And an official from the International Finance Corporation was in Washington was quoted as saying that institutional investors have about $110 trillion of investable assets globally. But about 80% of that is being invested in the developed world, and very little of it going into infrastructure in developing countries for certain. Largely because they don't have investment grade ratings. So there's plenty of capital. The problem is not capital. There's lots of money that would go into these investments if they thought that there were bankable projects and they could generate a reliable return. So if the US government were helping to provide greater certainty and expanding the pool of bankable projects, and working on project preparation and so forth, and addressing some of these risk factors that I stressed earlier, then infrastructure, and working on infrastructure principles and appropriate standards and safeguards through the multilateral development banks or through the OECD, then this could help mobilize this private capital looking for longer term returns. So, bottom line from all this, and I'll move to the last thing I wanted to talk about, which is shameless advertising for our work at CSIS. But it's difficult to judge how all this is going to turn out, but I think it's not too late for the United States and our private sector to be involved and to influence these events. I'm not predicting all those things are going to happen. In fact, we are somewhat distracted in Washington by some other issues, and our current government or our White House is not so interested in these multilateral endeavors, and so I'm not predicting all this is going to happen. I'm just saying what I think the U.S. could bring to the table against the big stakes that we have in all of this. So, at CSIS, as I mentioned, we're intensely focused on this story of infrastructure development across Eurasia. In October 2016, we launched an interactive website that we call Reconnecting Asia. The site has three main features. One is the map you see here, in which we plotted many of the infrastructure projects underway across the region. We started with transport infrastructure, roads, railways, ports, dry ports, not because that's the whole story, but just because this was a huge undertaking and we had to start somewhere. So we decided rather arbitrarily to start with transportation infrastructure. Our plan is to add other kinds of connectivity infrastructure, energy pipelines, power grids, ICT infrastructure over time. So behind this, which is the second feature of the site, is a database of over 2,100 projects, 2,100 and rising. I have 7 young researchers. Well, they're asleep now, but during the day, I hope they're asleep. They're working. We don't work them around the clock. But during the day, they spend all day typing in new data, so we're adding projects every day. And we're using publicly available information about who sponsored the project, who's financing it, who's building it, and so on, as well as any documentation we can find in the public domain related to the project. So one example of our database is we've got the famous Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge project listed. With this, if you find this project, you'll find first this map. And we've only put projects on the map with these lines if we're confident about the route of the project through satellite imagery, through matching that with the documentation from the funder or the sponsor. And so actually only about 1/3 of our projects are actually on the map. The database has 3 times as many projects as we actually show on our map. But, so you'll see this. By the way, this will be supposedly the world's longest sea bridge, so it's a big deal. The embedded map shows the exact location, as I say. And again, you're familiar with this project, so I don't need to elaborate. With each project in our database, we track specific indicators such as the type of infrastructure, road, rail, port, its status, the total reported cost, and we just list the local price. We don't try to estimate, we don't evaluate that, we don't even translate it into US dollars. We simply report it as is. We note which initiative it's related to, start of construction, planned completion date, as many of the contractors as we can find, consultants, and again, any documentation related to the project. And this database is searchable, so you can look for all projects, for example, funded by the ADB or the AIIB. There are only a dozen or so far, but we've got some of those in here. 2,100 projects, sounds like a lot, but of course is just a tip of the iceberg of what's going on across the supercontinent. But we are adding projects every day. The third element of the site is analysis, where we have research, shorter opinion articles from our own experts, by outside experts. We have satellite imagery, we have photographs, blog postings. There's a group of young men who, from Harvard who are driving from Venice to Beijing. I don't know where they are now. They're somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. And they're sending back pictures and blog postings for us, which we're posting on our site. And then we have deeper research projects. We've commissioned papers from other scholars. So this is a big undertaking, this project, this initiative, Reconnecting Asia. We're seeking partnerships because it's the only way we're going to get this story even partially completed. We're looking for organizations and individuals who have data, who have insight into these developments and are just interested in this story. So actually, you can actually, well, I'll tell you in a second. We want this site to be a public forum for study and debate on this historic set of issues, and we invite you to join us. The web address is down here, the URL. And if you go in there, you'll see actually, unfortunately, well, here it shows how you search the database. Down at the bottom of each page, I think there's a little link where you can click on if you want to become a partner. I think you just fill out a simple form, and then we're happy to have you as a partner and to see everything from photographs of the Macau Bridge or learned papers that you've written on these subjects. Everything in between we're interested in because we think this is a public good. We're trying to provide to be a basis for conversation. So that's my story. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to speculate about who's up and who's down in Washington if you want to know, but I can guess along with the best of them. Please welcome your questions. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Ron Manuel. I'm working for the Goodman Institute.
Thank you.
Just a question on this idea of labeling. Mm-hmm. So you had up the bridge before on the Hong Kong-Zhuhai Bridge, and here you've got it is a Belt and Road Initiative.
Oh, this one in the database.
Except it started in 2009.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the real problems, as someone who's worked on Belt and Road a little bit, is that we get this rebadging effect, whereby once a project starts, it's like, the classic example is they just finished a railway in Djibouti in Africa, except it started in 1988, the construction, and it's been labelled as the Belt and Road's greatest triumph thus far. The Belt and Road was announced in 2013, so that seems a little optimistic perhaps. How do you deal with this sort of post hoc rebadging problem?
Yeah.
Particularly when we're comparing, say, different countries as you are, which I think is a wonderful initiative. But when China sort of relabels everything as Belt and Road, whereas Japan goes from start for our $200 billion US fund, we're only going to take projects that are sort of coming.
Yeah.
And then does that lead to problems of sort of apples and oranges when you compare across these different countries? Thanks.
I mean, I think it's a good question and a fair challenge. I think we're trying to be as sort of neutral as we can in collecting the data and not put it through any kind of filter other than organizing it. And so if China calls it a Belt and Road project, even if it was 15 years, completed 15 years before that famous speech by President Xi in Kazakhstan, we're going to credit it as a Belt and Road project in our database. But then, we may well make exactly the comment you just made and have. We've actually, if you dig around in our analysis section, you'll see there's a piece in there about the fact that a lot of Belt and Road is a continuum of things that were already underway, and that things are being relabeled and the bumper sticker being put on these projects. So we comment on it in our analysis. We also invite scholars like you to go through our database and try and figure out yourself, search for all the Belt and Road projects and try and sift through those and figure out which ones you think are actually legitimate Belt and Road projects, post 2013, and which ones are just being relabeled. We'd welcome, if you do that work, to have you post it up here. So we're just, I know that's not a fully satisfactory answer, it's a bit of a dodge, but it's the only way we could be honest about or try to present the truth of what's actually happening, and then let ourselves and others try and filter that and analyze it, on the basis of what's reported. So that's been our approach, and it may be other methodologies, but that was the one that we thought was most credible. By the way, I didn't say, but we just arbitrarily, because we launched this in 2016, so we started as 2006, 10 years back was our starting point. So any project that was announced or ground dug or started or completed during that period, or even announced for the future, we're aiming to put in this database. And again, we started ground up. We didn't start from Belt and Road initiatives and work down. We started from the ground. Oh, there's a bridge being built there, or a railroad being built there. It's connecting point A and point B, and it was started after 2006. So we want it in our database, and then we'll find out who sponsored it, under what initiative, do they say it's under, who's funding it, who's financing it, who's building it, who are the subcontractors, what's the documentation. So that was our methodology for getting things in here. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, Varun Devi. I'm a private equity investor here in Hong Kong. I was at the Belt and Road Summit, on Monday, and folks from the IFC and other institutions clearly said that something like 80% of the funding is going to be kind of G to G, government to government type funding. You mentioned earlier, the projects that we've all read about, the Sri Lanka project, Myanmar project, that, at the end of the day, were not sustainable, and in some cases repayment risk and things like that were huge. As China gets very committed to getting this done, how much institutional learning has there been, in terms of structuring those G2G projects so that they don't appear, as being non-repairable? The history is not an easy one, but if they really want to put this amount of capital to work, that kind of behavior is going to have to change a little bit. Otherwise, you end up in situations where they really are the funder of last resort. No one will go to them unless they're absolutely desperate.
Yeah. No, and again, it's a good question, and again, I've got to dodge for an answer in the sense that we've been very focused on just trying to get the basic information in here, and we're still more in that phase of collecting data than we are in really analyzing our data. Again, we're sort of meanwhile going ahead and asking questions like this. So that is another question that we have asked about whether China is, whether there's a demonstration, there's actual evidence that China is changing its approach to this activity. No definitive and certainly not a quantitative answer to that question yet. Impressionistically, my sense is from just interviews and readings and so forth, is that they are paying more attention to those issues, including specifically debt sustainability. I think environmental sustainability has always been a feature since Belt and Road was announced. I mean, in earlier history, China probably paid less attention to that, but in the last probably 5 years for sure, they're paying more attention. Debt sustainability was not really thought about or considered, and I think that just anecdotally, when I was in China in May, I heard several counterpart scholars and things Chinese scholars mentioned this as a concern. Actually even mentioned neocolonialism as a concern, that China was going to get blowback, and used the term neocolonialism, which sort of struck me. So I think there's a growing consciousness about these issues. Whether that's translating into their actual investment behavior yet, I don't have a hard answer to, but it's a good question. I mean, China usually, without patronizing China as a 1.3 billion person country, but tends to kind of learn from experience in my, so that I wouldn't be surprised if they really are focusing more on those things. Although then that does raise the question of how much of this is actually going to be built, because somebody's got to pay for it at the end of the day. And so if there isn't a toll or some user fee or something that's going to return investment, is it going to be built if those concerns are really being paid attention to? Way in the back, and then you, sorry.
There's another dimension to this project, which is on one side you've got the tying of countries close together, but then there's also a potential trade diversionary effect as well. And if you talk to officials in Australia, there's a lot of concern in Australia about the possibility of Belt and Road reducing the demand for Australian exports. I think there's a similar kind of issue for some oil producers, particularly those in the peninsula, the Middle East, where oil exports from Central Asia could be taking a much bigger share of supply to China. So have you considered in terms of the trade diversionary effects and how that fits into the broader Chinese strategy?
Yeah, it's again a good question, and one that definitely we're interested in. And again, I don't have a definitive answer because we haven't done deep research on that, but it's definitely on our list of things we want to look at. I was in Australia last month for a 2-week tour around the country, sponsored by the State Department, to give talks about what the hell's going on in Washington, and what is our trade policy going to be about, which is another topic I'm following. But and Australians definitely, that specific example didn't come up, but there's a much more, compared to the time I went down a couple years earlier and did a similar tour, where everything was happy, we're digging stuff out of the ground, putting it on a ship and sending it to China, and everything's wonderful. There was a much more nuanced view, and some of those sorts of concerns were being raised that some of this activity could work against Australia's narrow interests. So it's a good question, and it's definitely a part of our research agenda, but we haven't got a good answer to that yet that's quantified. By the way, we're trying to, again, rent some of that expertise. It sounds like you have some. We would welcome, if you've written about this or want to write about it, from any credible source, we want to get that information up there. We're trying to provoke some of that, or prompt some of that, commission it through a series of big questions, as we call them, where we ask a question. We've done this, I think, 6 times so far. We've asked 6 different, kind of a diverse set of questions. We ask 5 or 6 different experts, an academic scholar, infrastructure, private equity investor, a government person, and to answer the question from the same division. And that sounds like a good question, to ask an array of folks, and I'll add it to my list. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Super interesting in terms of the ambition of the belt.
Right.
Can you speak a little bit about what the plans are in Europe and in terms of the infrastructure that they plan to create? Are they planning on taking over the existing European railway system, or is it building new infrastructure in that sense?
Right. Well, we do, as you can see, we've got a kind of concentration of projects, at least on the map, and I think in the database it's a similar sort of distribution, because we asked our researchers to look at Eastern Europe in particular. So we actually have quite a lot of projects. in that part of the world. And I would say there's definitely a lot of new things being built, like the high-speed rail between Budapest and Belgrade, I think, right? Which is a new project that China is financing. China is also proposing a lot of new infrastructure to East and South European countries through this 16+1 initiative, which they have this partnership. +1 is China, and the 16 are 16 East and South European countries. It's a broad initiative that it covers a lot of things, not just infrastructure investment. But when I was in Brussels in March, there was a lot of anxiety about this initiative because 11 of those 16 members are EU members, and there was a concern that European standards might be lowered by some of these countries. And so Brussels is constantly reminding these countries that there are EU standards that they have to maintain. So there, by the way, generally in Europe, I think, again, compared to a trip I had done 18 months earlier, that trip in March really struck me how there is a new sense of anxiety about Chinese investment, not just infrastructure investment, but Chinese investment in technology and existing infrastructure, which wasn't there 18 months earlier, where there was a very sort of happy feeling that this was going to be all very good for Europe. So whether in Berlin or Brussels or London, all of which I was in March, I think there's a growing anxiety about all this, which doesn't exactly answer your question. But I think it's a mix of new infrastructure investment and investing in existing stock. So again, we are looking at that, but again, I don't have any sort of quantitative answer to that, but it's something we're definitely, it's part of our footprint that we're looking at. Yes, sir.
And I fully support the view that the West, the United States and the West generally should become involved in this project. And in doing so, I think it creates economic opportunities and also strategic opportunities to play a role in which you can influence the way the process develops. But one thing that concerns me is that there's also a unipolar vision of this, where which is oppositional to this whole project, and that concerns me because it throws up issues which have not been discussed, but I think are quite important, and is that of currency wars. Because I think the problem is that if China is pressed and the East is pressed, there's already a tremendous amount of trade between Russia and China that's outside the dollar system. So I think if the West disengages from this and doesn't engage it, then there is a danger that there could actually be problems over currency. Because as we know, that the US dollar is under some duress because of debts and so on. People are actually sending dollars back to the United States. So I think that engaging in this constructively is very important.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot in your question, but to unpack that a bit, the part I'm least worried about in what you said is Russia-China. I mean, I think, Russia and China may have a marriage of convenience for now, but there are just deep differences of perspective, of interests, and I sort of think of them like, in the Batman movie with Heath Ledger, where all the bad guys got together and sort of were planning to take over the city, but by the end of the meeting, they were sticking pencils in each other's eyes. I think that's what's going to happen with Russia and China. I mean, I'm being a bit facetious, but I'm not so worried about that axis. In the short term, they can cause a lot of disruption or uncertainty, but I think fundamentally that is a relationship which is not going to present an alternative order in general. In specific areas, maybe. It is true, though, your point about currency arrangements, and I'd say payment systems, where China is developing a parallel payment system as well, which I think, and you could even apply this to the internet and areas where there's sort of an internet sovereignty approach to developing a kind of their own island. And I think I think that's partly due to their own assessment of their interests and ideology, perhaps, but also we're probably driving them to some extent in that direction, and we do have to be careful about that. I think that, at least President Trump, having said he was going to call China a currency manipulator on day one, has not yet done that, I always say. Not that he's never going to do it, but he hasn't done it. And I think we are also, I think we made a terrible mistake with the AIIB in the way we handled that. I mean, I don't think our instincts were wrong, actually. I'm a little bit out of, this is a bit of a controversial statement. I think there was a reason to raise questions about the governance and the operations of this bank, and even the need for another institution, another bureaucracy to do this business when you've already got the World Bank and the ADB and policy banks and lots of people, and it wasn't an issue of capital. So why do we need a new bank? I think that was a legitimate question to ask, but let's ask it in a polite way and not just blow the thing up and make it look like we're opposing China's initiative. That was very foolish, and we've paid a price. The only good thing about that is that having shot ourselves in both feet and sprawled over the track, we kind of slowed the Chinese down, and they've had to be more accountable because now the spotlight is on them, and all those unwashed Europeans who joined the AIIB helped keep them more honest, as it were, and I think they elevated their game, and that's a good thing, I think, for the public, for the global order. So through our foolishness, and we actually maybe helped make the AIIB a better institution. But I think we should engage now constructively in some way. We're not going to join the AIIB because the US Congress, in my lifetime, is never going to approve $1 of funding for a Chinese-led bank. But we could be more positive about it. We could encourage co-financing, and we could do other things to make the order fairer. And I think that is a legitimate beef of China and the other emerging markets, that the order that we established, and it sounds like you're, maybe British origin, the Anglo-American order that was established in 1944. China was at the table, different China, but it was China there, one of the 44 countries. We were all there putting this order together. It was, very much shaped in our image, and and I think life has gone on, and we, the economic weight in the world has shifted, and these institutions and processes that were set up have not shifted sufficiently to account for that shift in global economic weight, and that's creating, I think, this sense of aggrievement that is feeding the kinds of risks that you're talking about, and I think we need to address it. Now, to be fair, sorry, you've got me going here. To be fair, I think the order, and I've written about this, has been more adaptable than China and India and Russia and Brazil claim. I mean, we did move from a G7 to a G20 world in 2008. Okay, admittedly, when the plane was crashing and burning and we needed the passengers to come up front to help stabilize the plane, but then a conscious decision was made by the Obama administration to broaden the table. And China hosted the G20 last year. So I don't think it's fair to say that China doesn't have a voice in global governance, in global economic governance. We did follow through on the World Bank and IMF quota reforms. Yes, it took way too long to do the IMF ones, but we did what ultimately we said we were going to do. It's not complete. We need to keep moving in that direction. And we accommodated, ultimately, the establishment of a new institution, or new institutions, because there are other ones, the BRICS Bank and others. So, I think we're moving and can and should move more in this direction to avoid the kinds of risks you're talking about, because I think those are real, and we don't want to give. But if you're at the head of the table, if you're given a seat at the head of the table, and given the gavel and the microphone, then you have an obligation. And there are 20 other players around the table representing 85% of the world's economy. Then you have an obligation either to defend the existing rules and institutions that you're in charge of, or to propose a new set of rules that works for everybody, not just for the chairman. So that to me is the burden we need to put back on the emerging market. Is we need to give you more space. But if you're in that position, you need to do things that work not only for you but for everybody. That may be a little sort of naive, but I think that's what we should be insisting on. We're not at all doing that right now, so I'm very worried about what the U.S. is doing in this regard. But I think that's what the deal, the grand bargain, should be. We'll make the order more inclusive, but we all have to work together to make things, make economic and political outcomes better for everyone. So that's what I would say if I were emperor. Yes.
And the first comment is that you began your presentation with the description of troubles, the infrastructure deficit, and the huge challenges, which I think actually pointed to the fact that the risk and the potential are proportional to each other. And so in a way, your comments about the US and the gentleman's comments about trade diversion is perhaps an anxiety-prone schizophrenia, if I may say so. Because I mean, I think the challenge of actually capitalizing on these areas before they actually real trade rebellion will be, I think, many, many years to come. Their situation is much worse than the new members of the European Union. The rapid expansion and of the European Union, and we have actually, in a way, dragged down the European Union in some way. And my question is prompted by your dialogue about the way the US treated AIIB. And in a way, I read something saying that actually the AIIB is a revulsion by Asia to the governance of the Bretton Woods institution, which actually was illustrated by the way the IMF handled the Asian financial forum. And so in a way, now, if my recollection is correct, America is the only big country now, I mean, in this sort of area, to say no or to turn a cold shoulder to this initiative. So with the AIIB as the background, how would you comment on the U.S. attitude so far to the Belt and Road Initiative? Bearing in mind that Russia also joins in. Obviously, I think at the end of the day, there's no lasting friendship among countries. Ultimately, it's just self-interest, alliances, or convenience.
Again, there's a lot in that question. I think that, but they're all good points. I think that certainly the U.S. paid a price for, for the 1997 Asian financial crisis and the way that was handled, and obviously for the 2008 crisis as well. And that, understandably, I think, has raised questions about whether the U.S. is either able or willing to perform, the role of sort of benevolent, economic hegemon in the world that it played for 50 or 60 years after World War II. And so, I think it's not surprising that Asians would be having those conversations. I don't think the AIIB should be viewed, though, as, and I mean, either the way China approached it, which, from their stated position, they weren't trying to destroy the order, they were trying to strengthen the order by making an institution that was leaner, cleaner, and greener than the World Bank and ADB. And I don't have any problem with that. If you can deliver all those things and get the money out the door and provide the public goods, then I think that is an enhancement of the order potentially. And so, and I always separate out the notion of, again, the seating order and who gets to run the institutions or the processes versus the substance and the content of what's actually being done. And I think China has been more concerned about the former and the sense of ownership or voice than they have about really coming up with a whole new set of rules. So I don't see these things quite as disruptive as in practice. And the AIIB is just not that big. It doesn't matter that much in a sense by itself. Belt and Road's a much bigger deal. So I think all of that is, those are all, I think, legitimate points. The one thing, though, is that certainly from a U.S. perspective, there is a compelling national interest in being engaged in Asia-Pacific affairs. We're a Pacific power. We're not an Asian country, but we are a Pacific power. And we have overriding economic, political, security interests in this part of the world. And so I think we are inevitably drawn to this, to be engaged in integration efforts in this part of the world. And so from our side, there's a compelling interest, and I think we will be drawn back to that even if we're currently distracted from that pursuit of those interests. And then I think from the perspective of most of Asia, the United States is still, notwithstanding immediate concerns and uncertainties, I think in general the U.S. is still viewed as a valuable contributor to Asia-Pacific affairs because we're providing, still a security underpinning in the region. And I think even China, to the extent the U.S. military engagement here not only deals with some immediate security concerns, but also, prevents other countries in the region from, if you want to call it, remilitarizing. That's a contribution that even China welcomes. But certainly the rest of Asia, I think, welcomes that role for the United States. And I think they welcome our economic participation because we are still, at least by some measures, the largest economy in the world. We still have a lot of capital, a lot of technology, a lot of innovative capability that people want. And we bring the rule of law, and we bring, the other things that come with American goods and services. So I still think that there's a mutual interest in having us engaged. Whether we're all executing on all this the right way is another question, but I think those are all mutual interests. Yes, sir.
I just want to first make a comment and a simple question. The comment is, yes, I've often been a somewhat skeptical of the efforts by China. But actually, when you look at what China has done so far, right, the whole portfolio is pretty interesting. AIIB alone may not amount to much. The Silk Road Bank may not amount to much individually. But if you put all the other things into the same picture, including the Belt and Road, especially if Trump, is going to take the U.S. further out of the international stage in the next 3.5 years. So in 5 years' time, the whole situation may be such that all the current and future programs by China may actually amount to a very meaningful alternative or a challenge to the U.S.-dominated international order, or including infrastructure and so on.
Yeah.
Because on the other hand, if you look at what the U.S. has been doing on certain fronts, including currency and financial policies. Let me just use my own experience over the last 2 years here in Hong Kong as an example. As a U.S. citizen, I found almost no bank who would be willing to let me open an account. I understand, because of anti-money laundering and anti-tax evasion reasons, the U.S. agencies have made it almost impossible for any foreign bank or foreign institution to do anything with U.S. citizens. So this will further force other countries' financial institutions and so on to try to do something with other systems, rather than the U.S. dollar-based financial system, right? So regarding the currency, this gentleman brought up earlier, don't blame China for trying to promote the renminbi, because it's the U.S. doing, and also you mentioned about the governance structure for existing multilateral institutions. But from the Chinese perspective, look at the World Bank and the IMF. The IMF head has to be a European, and the World Bank head has to be an American. From an institutional optimization, institutional design perspective, why is that the optimal outcome?
No, it isn't.
Right?
Yeah.
So then, with these two institutions being governed the way as they were designed, what should other countries do?
Yeah.
So this kind of brings up all the natural sort of concerns and demands out of Latin America or Asia or Africa and so on. So my question is, can you predict 5 years from now, how would the picture be?
No, I think, again, all good points, and I think we have been our own worst enemy in a lot of these things. I think getting to the end of your question about the World Bank and IMF, I think that those things are indefensible. I mean, why should there be a particular nationality heading one of these institutions? So if I were God again, I would change that. And it's certainly, it's obviously a sore point. So why just, for no particular value, I think, these days, continue that. But I think take an issue like, a set of issues like that, I think those issues would have been less controversial had the U.S. been seen to be delivering the kinds of results that it delivered for 40, 50 years after World War II. And I think because of a series of events over the last 20 years, and I name 4 in particular, all of which have been touched on in this conversation, the 1997 Asian financial crisis and our response to that. Not that everything we did in substance was wrong, but certainly the way we delivered the messages was not helpful. The terrorist attacks of 2001, which was not our fault, but which we overreacted to, in my opinion. That's a controversial statement to make this week when I don't want to in any way suggest that that was not a traumatic and terrible event for our country. But I think in the way you're talking about your bank account, I think that was part of an overreaction to those events. I think obviously the 2008 crisis and then the election of Donald Trump, I'd say those 4 things have understandably raised concerns about whether the U.S. can continue to deliver. So I think there's legitimacy in the order and the U.S. role in the order, provided the U.S. is delivering, even if it's not yet fully balanced and fair and even delivering everything it promises. But if we're not performing the way we need to, then it's understandable that the legitimacy of the order is going to be questioned, and alternative arrangements are going to be made. And I didn't say that the renminbi shouldn't be internationalized. I think it should. It makes sense. And I think the IMF, again, accommodated that a step toward in that direction. So it shows that the order, again, is adaptable, but it does require U.S. leadership and U.S. kind of performance that's seen as legitimate and and again, enlightened self-interest. Because I don't think people expect us not to act in our self-interest, but we have traditionally acted in a more enlightened way than we have in the last 20 years, I'll acknowledge. So, actually, can we just let another person have a chance? Maybe we can talk afterwards. Yes, sir.
I have a quick question about innovation. Can you tell us about what developments you're tracking in terms of internet infrastructure investments, such as data centers, submarine cable links, and new satellite systems, and how those investments fit in with China's innovation agenda?
Right. We aren't yet. In terms of our data set, we aren't yet looking at the, as I mentioned, our intention is to do ICT writ large infrastructure, but we haven't gotten there yet. We have had people comment on those points, and so we've had a number of writings you'll see in our analysis of the implications of innovation along these infrastructure corridors. And so it's an important topic again, but just not one we've really delved into yet. And it's a big, there's a big competition there for the model for digital governance that is most appropriate or most broadly beneficial. And there's a big debate there, which you sound like you're more expert on than I am, so I'm not going to insult your intelligence by laying all that out. But that is a huge issue in itself, apart from its relationship to this infrastructure story. And I have a colleague at CSIS, Jim Lewis, who does technology policy, and he's written a lot on this, so you might look at Jim's work. Other questions? Didn't give everybody a chance. Do you want to have another shot?
Just a quick one. This is the week that Steve Bannon also came to Hong Kong.
Right. I missed him, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, and I know people who were invited who decided not to go.
Yeah.
He does have that reputation. You have experience in terms of how the White House works, and I guess for the benefit of this audience, it would be useful to get your perspectives, in terms of how this dysfunction is going to affect the ability to get anything passed. There are the tax policy is a big thing. Bannon comes here, he's talking about trade war, with China, and there's the whole North Korea situation. So it would be helpful to get your perspective in terms of how you see what's happening in the White House and how things, may transpire, particularly as it affects, significant events in Asia or developments in Asia.
Well, I think I don't have a very sort of happy story to tell here. I mean, I think there's a lot of reason for concern, and I think there will be continued uncertainty as long as Donald Trump is president. So I could spin you a story about the so-called adults taking over on some issues, and I think that's true. I mean, on trade, objectively speaking, he's only done one catastrophic thing, which is to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that outweighs all the other positive things I'm about to say. He did not call China a currency manipulator, as he said he would. He did not put 45, or has not put 45% tariffs on Chinese imports. He has not walked away from the WTO. He's not torn up NAFTA. He has not torn up Chorus. But all of those things are still possible. And I think, as long as Trump is president, I think there's always going to be that risk. And meanwhile, which by itself creates a lot of uncertainty. And I believe I was sort of taught when I was doing trade policy that, I believe in the sort of bicycle theory that you need to keep moving forward trade liberalization or the bicycle falls over. And so even if we don't do those backward things, if we're not pushing a proactive agenda, I think that's a real problem for us and for the global economy. So I got lots of worries there. I am also, I think in terms of a positive agenda, some of the things that Trump says he wants to do, no matter how he says them, are not wrong things to be focused on. I mean, tax reform has been 30 years since we did real tax reform, and there's some real problems in our tax system, and I think there's bipartisan agreement in principle that we need to do tax reform, but in practice it's going to be extremely difficult. If any of his agenda gets through, it's going to be that because there's such a compelling logic to do something on taxes. I think there are areas of the economy that are overregulated. I think there are, immigration is a challenging issue because, a lot of people, despite everything, still want to come to the United States, and we have to manage that in a reasonable way, and it's quite a challenging issue. I don't think building a wall is the way to solve that problem, but I do think raising that as a serious priority for policy is not a mistake. Infrastructure investment is clearly needed, as I've alluded to several times, in the United States. So, but I don't see any of that really moving forward. The deregulation part, yes. Maybe it'll be easier to get your bank set up, although maybe not because of the terrorism concerns. Other restrictions on banks may be lifted. Tax reform is the big one, and I'm not confident, given the state of our debate right now, how that's going to play out. And the only thing there are 2 points of reassurance. One is that, there are some adults around, and whether you're talking about some of the cabinet members who are serious people and are, I think, are credible folks dealing with the issues like North Korea, like the sort of more positive things that have been not where with the constraints on some of the bad trade policies, have been done by some of these adults. And so I think, and Bannon is gone. And there are things there are reasons that you can feel that some things are normalizing, and we've got a very solid bureaucracy that is still got some very talented people who are doing their best in all these areas. Although some are leaving, so that is a concern. And then finally, so that's the sort of shorter term comfort, but I won't deny overall I'm losing a lot of sleep myself over some of these things. Longer term, I do think the U.S. has these compelling interests, and I think you can change a leader, you can change policies in an election, but you can't change national interests. So, I've used this metaphor maybe too much, but we may have just hit the ball into the woods as a golfer. We may have hit deeply into the woods here, but you can't change the rules of golf. You still got to get that ball in that hole, and we will be drawn back to that. And we're a good golfer, and we'll be back on the green eventually. So that's the only other piece of comfort I can give. I don't believe this is the end of history or that the U.S. is finished. I think if you believe that, I think be careful, because the U.S. is formidable and we will be back in many ways. We may not do everything right. We may have lost a lot of time, and I worry about that in the short term, but I think we'll be back. Yes, ma'am, maybe the last.
Just a follow-up to that,
Yeah.
actually. How hopeful are you for the November EAS and everything in light of all of this? If this will be a major summit that you'll be attending with a lot of the leaders from this region, how hopeful are you that he's not going to
Right.
completely muck it up? Or
Look, I mean, there are, again, the experience in the 8 months so far has been that, when the president's interacted personally or on phone calls with other leaders, that hasn't always gone, as scripted or as well as we'd all like. But net, I mean, overall, I actually think that the experience of his participating in these summits has been positive, net positive, and has been getting better, in the sense that I think he's getting a greater, and he and his people are getting a greater appreciation of the value of these interactions. And so the mere fact that at APEC and then at the East Asia Summit, the president will be interacting with the leaders of China and Japan and Korea and others, I think is going to be net positive. And what I think is going to be more in my bicycle theory, what I worry about more than, there's going to be some awkward stuff, and expect awkward handshakes and all the rest of it. But what I worry about most is that we're not going to do what we typically do in the first presidential trip to Asia in the fall of the first year, which is laying out a strategy, usually through a big speech before he goes or while he's on the road. Obama did this. Bush was in different circumstances because of 9/11, but it's a typical thing to do in your first year. And I'm worried that we're not going to get that sort of articulation of a grand strategy and a set of interests in this part of the world. And the absence of that is a problem, in my view. I think somebody needs to give a speech about our strategic interests in this part of the world. And that hasn't happened, and I'm worried it might not. But all really good questions. I'm sorry my answers were so long and I didn't give everyone a chance, but thank you for your attention.
Oh, thank you very much. So we all ended on a very positive note. Just as Mr. Goodman was responding to Varun's last question, I was feeling good that our talk today would actually end on a very positive note. Then Ima brought up this last question, which made me really worried. Go back again. So, but overall, I think the note is still very positive. So we have a lot of good things to hope for, not only in this part of the world, but also in Washington, D.C. Of course, that's probably for the next 3 years very difficult to really get too much of. Anyway, so let's thank Mr. Goodman again.
Thank you. And in addition to looking at Reconnecting Asia, we stream almost everything we do at CSIS. So I know the hours are a little bit difficult, and we tape everything. So we have a lot of interesting stuff on many of the topics we've talked about. And if you come to Washington, please come and visit CSIS anytime. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you all for coming.